9th to 10th century, which can be called the Jaina period because the authors of this period were all Jainas, and the writings of this period more or less expresses Jaina philosophy, though what the philosophy proposes, poetry proposes, because the subtext negate what the main text is trying to say. And the ideal that's central to this corpus of texts is the attainment of Purusharthas. It starts with Dharma, Artha, Kama, with a lot of emphasis on Kama. It culminates in Moksha. And the poetic that informs the writings of this period is based on conformity to classics, marga kind of expression, but I prefer to use the word tatsama and tadbhava tradition because it's modeled after the examples of Sanskrit poetics. And then we moved into the 11th and 12th century, which led to the efflorescence and then almost an explosion in the two-thirds of the 12th century of Vachana composition. This period has been described as Virashaiva period. I rejected this nomenclature. I prefer it Sharana literature for reasons I explained to you in the last class. So what we see, there's a fundamental change of what I first called she, which is the term I use for model of the mind, from the Jaina age to the Sharana age. In the Jaina imagination, centrality of Purushartha, whereas the Sharana period, it valorizes the ideal of Sharanatva, which is surrender. As I said, there are three streams. This whole tradition began with artisans, cobblers and weavers and basket makers from artisan caste, and later a figure called Banna, he was converted into this movement. He gave it a kind of organizational structure, or at least he was trying to give it an organizational structure, but he didn't quite succeed because the movement, which is supposed to begin during this period, was disrupted because of the violation of the caste rules in the society of that period. But we don't know the reasons. But unfortunately, most of what we know about the history of this period is mythology. And this mythology was built during the third phase, which corresponds to the rise and fall of Vijayanagara Empire. Of course, historians have pointed out that Vijayanagara Empire marks the consolidation of Hinduism in the south, and in fact, as far as I know, Annapurna may like to correct me, the first occurrence of the word Hindu we find in the title of Vijayanagara emperors. They had two titles, Hindu Raya Suratrana and Vaidika Marga Rakshaka. But unfortunately, there's nothing native about this Hindu about this word, because the word Hindu itself was given to us by foreigners, and the word Suratrana is a and Upper Brahmsha of Sultana. And then Vaidika Marga Rakshaka, this another title of Vijayanagara emperors. And many historians, particularly at the time of nationalist movement, and also later painted a glorious picture, a very glorious picture of the Vijayanagara Empire. But unfortunately, what we see in Kannada text is just the opposite. It's a period of violence, of exploitation, and most of what we find in the cultural expressions of this period is a, a kind of reaction away from the values represented by Vijayanagara. One important thing that happened during this period was the collection, anthologization, and exegesis of the Vachana law in 14th century during the reign of Praudadevaraya of Sangama dynasty. And the tradition tells us that this exercise was undertaken by Nurondu Viraktaru, 101 Viraktas, monks. So it was they who collected these manuscripts, who wrote it down, put them down on the manuscripts, and they built different kinds of narratives based on this text. One is how to put the text together. I said the Sharana movement had beginnings in the artisan class, but there was another tradition parallel to it which later mingled with it. This was the tradition of Shaivite monotheism, which was mostly represented by upper castes. And then there was also another tradition of Avadutas and yogis like Allama Prabhu Mahadevi. So these were the three tributaries that made up this the corpus of Sharana expression. But during the period of Vijayanagara Empire, it is the militant Shaivite section which which hijacked the whole tradition. This is clear from the narratives that they built up. One is they tried to interpret. We have seen how Sharana expression was antagonistic to the Sanskritic mode of the previous period. And this is very clear, whereas the Jaina period talked about the poetics of conformity, the Sharana period talks about the poetics of spontaneity and freedom. But during this period, the period of collection and anthologization, it was brought back into the fold of the great Sanskritic tradition. So the philosophy of Sharanas was interpreted in the light of one school of Vedanta which had become popular a couple of centuries earlier. It was the Shakti Vishishtadvaita philosophy which came from Andhra, and the scholar who wrote a commentary on the Brahma Sutras from this viewpoint was one Sripati Panditaradhya from Andhra. So this became the model. And then they tried to map out the Vachana texts according to a system of spiritual evolution, different stages of yoga. This is called six-phase system, Shasthala yoga. So the sadhaka of Virashaivism, they said, passes through six stages, from the dualistic consciousness of a bhakta to the monistic consciousness of an aikya. So it was the whole spiritual progress was mapped out on a linear kind of model. And they built up narratives. There were two kinds of narratives that were built up during this period. One was Basavanna became the center of this sacred history. And this practice began not in Karnataka but in Andhra, because the earliest biographer of Basavanna was Palkurke Somanatha, who wrote this work, Basava Puranamu, which is a very important work in Telugu. And he made Basavanna the hero of this movement. And in Palkurke Somanatha, the emphasis is on, though there's a lot of criticism about caste system and so on, the main emphasis is on militant devotion to Shiva. And then there was another trend in constructing the narratives of this period. This was done by Viraktas, those who were the parts of the monasteries, Virashaiva monasteries, which were coming up during this period. Because before this period, most of the monasteries in Karnataka, the most powerful monasteries from 10th century to 12th century, were led by the monks of the Karamukha Shaivite order. Karamukha was originally a tantric cult, but by 10th century they had entered the mainstream, they had adopted many agamic and Vedic rituals, and they had established several important universities in different parts of Karnataka. For example, Basavanna himself studied at the university in Kudala Sangama, which was headed by one Jataveda Muni, who was originally a Karamukha, a monk of the Karamukha order, and later all these Karamukha monasteries converted themselves into Virashaivism because it became very influential during the period of Prodhadevaraya. So these people built up another narrative, a parallel narrative of the 12th century sacred history, where Allama was the central figure. This was done in poetic narratives, and the most important poetic narrative of this period is by Chamarasa, Prabhulinga Lile, which was later translated into Tamil a couple of centuries by Shiva Prakasha Swami as Prabhulinga Lile. Professor Shulman and I are going to read the translations of the same passages, corresponding passages in the two texts tomorrow. And another most important narrative they built up was a dramatic narrative. This dramatic narrative is called Shunya Sampadana. Whereas in Basva-centric narratives, the emphasis is on militant devotion to Shiva. In Allama-centric narratives, the emphasis was on Advaitic mysticism. It's not Advaita of the Shankaracharya kind, but it's a kind of Shivadvaita. When we go through the text, we'll, some of the extracts that we're going to read, this becomes clear to us. And in between, before these narratives, Basava-centric narratives and Allama-centric narratives appeared, in the intervening period, there was a Shaivite poet called Harihara, who perhaps belonged to the Tamil Shaivism, Shaiva Siddhanta philosophy. His was dualistic Shaivism. He recontextualized the histories of Sharanas like Basavanna, Allamaprabhu, Akamadevi, and wrote poetic narratives in the Ragade style. Ragade is a form that had come from Prakrit. It was widely prevalent in folklore of Kannada before the 12th century. So he adapted this form. But Harihara is closer, appears to be closer to facts than later narrators. What we find in later narratives is some of the values of Vachanas are reversed. When we read the Vachanas, we could see that there was emphasis on individual experience, on sensory experience, and there was a daring uh, encounter with human sexuality. And most important of all, in the Vachana law, there is a complete rejection of moksha or the other world. Because for them, liberation is here and now. This is illustrated in one of the episodes of Shunya Sampadane, which I'm going to summarize because it's a very long episode. Therefore, I didn't make the translation of this passage. So the ideal of Kayaka became marginal to the concerns of these new narratives of the sacred history of the 12th century. And spirituality was personified as a woman called Maya. And Maya becomes a major figure in Prabhulinga Lile. Now, the interesting thing here is Maya normally means illusion. But in Prabhulinga Lile and in Shuddha Sampadne, Maya is a flesh and blood character. Uh, Part of the reason is that in the Sharana philosophy, Maya does not mean unreal or illusion. In Shaivite Tantras, Maya means magic, a charmer, magician, and so on. Whereas the ideal of truth, which Allama represents, is without a body. He is called Bailudehi. His body consists of void. So Maya, who was a character according to these narrators, is a very human, flesh and blood character. Where Allama is without a body. Huh? Maya is a concrete reality, whereas the ideal is all emptiness, void. That's why this dramatic narrative is called Shunya Sampadane, the gathering of void, emptiness. Now, apart from these sacred narratives, during this period, there were a lot of secular narratives, Charitra Kavyas. And the most important one being a cycle of narrative around a small prince called Kumararama. It's very strange that none of our Kannada poets chose to write on the emperors of Vijayanagar, with the exception of two narrative poems about the period of Prabhudevaraya Kavya, and then Pampas Sthana Varnanam, which are by Chandra Kavi, which are minor works. But majority of writings completely ignore these emperors. And one figure called Kumararama, who was the son of a petty king called Kampilaraya, became the hero of at least 6 narrative poems written in Kannada. He became an immensely important figure in the collective imagination of Karnataka. Before I come back to Shunya Sampadne, let me, uh, I could I didn't get the translation because these passages are very long. I'll sum it up for you. Kumararama is the son of Kampilaraya. And the poet, and the most important version, most a beautiful version of the story is written by one Nanjunda Kavi, who is perhaps a Veerashaiva, but he does not mention any of the Sharanas as his ancestors. He mentions only Sanskrit poets, Kalidasa, Bana, and so on. Like he equates Pampa, who equated uh, Arjuna with his patron, uh, Arikesari. Kumararama compares his hero with Arjuna. So this is a mode which has come down from Jaina Kavyas. But and he has also brought in all the Ashtadasha Varna's 18 descriptions of Mahakavya in Sanskrit. But the content is completely different from that of the so-called classics of the previous period. Kumararama becomes a kind of anti-hero. And though the poet is trying to establish Kumararama as a kind of Arjuna, he ends up by establishing a villainous character who can be, I mean, villainous within quotes, according to the poet, who could be a descendant of Amrutamati of Yashodhara Charita, Ratnaji. Kampilaraya has this brave son, Kumararama, who is fighting battles with all the neighboring princes, winning them. Of course, he is married to 4 wives, but he is famed as Paradara Sodara. He is the brother of other women. And Kampilaraya, in his old age, falls in love with a girl from the caste of acrobats, Domba community. He forces her into marriage. Her name is Ratnaji. And she's very beautiful. And there is a scene in the poem where people of the city are celebrating the festival of Manmata. And she's watching the procession, and she sees Kumar Rama coming with his bow and arrow all decked up. And immediately the poet says, he doesn't say she fell in love with him, she wanted to sleep with him. He uses these words. She was sexually aroused by him. And she tells her maid, go get him. She says, no, no, he's Paradara so that he won't come. And the maid asks her, he's like your son because he's married to his father. How can you think of such a thing? She says, look here, I did marry this old man. He frightened me into this marriage. So I'm not in freedom. But I am not attracted to that man, I'm attracted to this young man. Go get him. And she brings Kumar Rama. Kumar Rama is tricked into coming into a chamber. He's playing some kind of ball game. And by mistake, the maid arranges in such a way that the ball comes into Ratnaji's chamber. So he's tricked into coming there. And Ratnaji expresses her desire openly. She makes no bones about it. But you're like my mother. This is harlotry. This is not love. Ratnaji says, you read the Ramayana and read the Mahabharata. All of them begin with harlotry. And why was Sita true to Rama? Not because she wanted to be true, because she was more handsome than other men. He was more handsome than other men. So she argues with this kind of brutal logic, which knocks at the foundation of values of the heroic age. This is a very interesting thing. And this ends up as a tragedy. once Kumara Rama rejects her love, she complains to Kampilaraya that he tried to rape her, and Kampilaraya is infuriated because she's his dearest queen, youngest queen, and he can't hope to get any younger wife the next time. So he orders that Kumara Rama be executed. But the minister decides to not to do this because he knows that the kingdom of Kampilaraya can at any time be attacked by the Suratara, that is Sultan of Delhi. And Kumar Rama is so brave that he has already proved his mind even to Sultan. There's another twist to the story. The, the, the daughter of the Sultan in Delhi has seen Kumar Rama's picture. She is deeply in love with him. And his friend, instead of killing him, he hides him somewhere. And there is somebody who looks exactly like Kumar Rama. He tells him, see, Kampilaraya wants Kumar Rama. I can't kill him because he needed to protect our kingdom against the onslaught of Sultan. It's very interesting that many editors of this book, this text, say that this represents the struggle between Hinduism and Islam. In the text, there's no mention of Hinduism anywhere. The Sultan is referred just as Sultan, not a Muslim ruler. Nowhere does it say he was a Muslim ruler. Anyway, then Malik Kafur comes down, attacks Kamil Rai's kingdom, and Kumar Rama is brought out. He fights with the commander, but he is captured and is taken to Delhi, and he dies on the way. And the daughter of Sultan also commits suicide. So this is the story. It's a very brutal story. So this happens before the rise of Vijayanagar in the intervening period, and all the historical points like Sirivana Charita, which are written during this period, show that this period was one of the most brutal periods in history. There's another text called Sirivana Charita, and the carnage, the massacre that went on in those days, how the conqueror looted the defeated, is described, depicted with brutal honesty in these texts. So the historical texts are not talking about order, they're talking about chaos. Whereas these people who constructed these narratives of the 12th century are trying to uh, imagine an order. They're creating the myth of an order. It is at this time that Kalyana becomes a symbol of a utopian city in Kannada imagination. For example, in Shunya Sampadne, there's a description of the city of Kalyana. It says there were Lakshada Mele Tombattaru Swavira Shiva Gadangada, 196,000 devotees lived in the city. There were some 6,000 Shiva temples, and there were some 10,000 monasteries of Shiva Gurus, and there were so many yogis. All this is written. So they create a utopia of the past in this text. This is very important. The utopia they're talking about is in the past. And the transcendence that they're talking about, the spirituality they're talking about, is at several removes from the cauldron of experience. So they're building these narratives. Around this time, I am not focusing on the interregnum of Vaishnavism, which emerged around the reign of Krishna Devaraya. nearly 2 centuries after Devaraya. And Krishnadev impact seems to be much more on Telugu literature and Kannada literature. There was a institution that came up in Vijayanagara. It's called two parallel institutions, Dasakota and Vyasapita. Uh, Madhvacharya in 12th century, the philosopher established the dualistic school. His philosophy had become very popular, and it got royal patronage at the time of Krishnadevaraya, who was, for the most part, pro Vaishnava, whereas Devaraya was pro Shaiva. This led to a brief efflorescence of Vaishnavite compositions of great dasas. Vyasapita was an institution where the esoteric aspects of Madhva philosophy were discussed. Dasakota was the place where these teachings were made available to the lay public through the compositions in Kannada by saint singers like Purandaradasa and Kanakadasa. And it's very interesting to contrast the compositions with that of Kshetriya and Annamacharya that Professor Shulman was talking about in previous class. There's absolutely no Shringara in their bhakti. It's mostly Dasya bhakti. So most of the moving poems of this period don't talk about Krishna the lover. They talk about Krishna the Lord, the warrior. Krishna the child. So Vatsalya bhakti becomes very important here. And unlike Sharanas, they don't question the foundations of Shastras and conventions. They accept it, but they're trying to humanize Vaishnavism just a little bit. And that they did not completely go beyond caste system is expressed in the myth about the temple of Udupi, Sri Krishna temple in Udupi, where Kanakadasa, who was a dasa from Kuruba caste, of a shepherd caste, he wanted to enter the temple, but the legend goes that he was not allowed to enter the temple. So the deity himself turned backwards. Now the entrance to Krishna temple is through the back door entry, because they say because Kanaka was outside, Krishna turned. And why wasn't Kanaka allowed into the temple? To show this miracle to the people that he was a great saint. Uh, so it was not against the existing system, unlike the Sharana expressions. Uh, so this is one development. And during this period, another expression of Kannada Bhagavata culture, Vaishnava culture, was the great translation of the Mahabharata by Kumaravyasa. And before I go back to Shunya Sampadne and Prabhulingali, etc., I want you to read this passage from Kumaravyasa Bharata, because here you have a modern satire on the court. For Pampa, who wrote Mahabharata in the 9th century, Mahabharata was a story of heroes. But for Kumaravyasa, it's Krishna's story. It says, Tiriye Hedeva Krishna Kate Ide Jarimu. He was a great poet, great master of metaphors, and I'm not going into detail because there's no time, and because I'm concerned with other broader movements of thought and imagination. And some people, some scholars say that when you say Krishna Kate, story of Krishna is talking about Krishna Devaraya. But whenever he talks about kings and Brahmins, he bursts into vituperative satire. And here is an example of the satire. We'll start with number 31. So Krishna is about to come. This is in Sabha Parva. Is describing the court Duryodhana. Dhritarashtra sat with his queen on the right hand side on a worthy throne made of gold. Pandits clever as four headed Brahma, masters of logic, scriptures, and of arts of every kind, scholars of admired virtues, these adorn the king's court. So this appears to be the praise of the court, but stay with me. The great court was arranged in such a way that Ahobala, Madra, Shakuni, and Saindava, Kamboja, the valorous king, Purishrava, the lord of chariots, Sulochana, and the brave Vrishasena, terrible fires of battle, all sat on the left, sketched, as it were, with diamond and gold. 100 of the Kaurava's offspring, youthful, well-built and handsome, sat impressively in the front. On either side sat the king's 100 brothers, wearing crowns, anklets, pendants round the neck and swords in hands, as though they had tossed up to skies the moon, jealous of their moon-like faces, and held the moon's roots in hands. The chauris in the hands of moon-faced beauties shone in splendor on either side, thus making splendid. On his left appeared in glory the ministers. This is where he begins to satirize the court. The ministers who could sever heads with a single strand of hair. ಕೂದಲೇ ಕೊರಳ ಸೀಳುವ ಜಾಣರು, cause by tricks enemy kings to lose heart, paralyze the rulers of lands, but when pleased with bribe, drive to tears, with ministerial comes with anger. Elders whose pot bellies were all swollen with collections of wide-ranging scriptures. Those all scriptures had gone into their bellies, not into their heads. Logic, sacred epics, and poetry of all sorts. Strange monsters whose beards had grown long like pendant roots of dense branches. These too graced the king's court. And there sat poets, versed in four tongues, skilled in every art of varied similes, metaphors, hyperboles, in the brilliant, beautiful, sweet, and delicate compositions, also able to analyze in a second an endlessly complicated poem. And orators, causing one to nod in amazement. Once they spoke, and those who could make you exclaim, "Ah!" with hidden tongue Kannada. He said they never spoke direct, straight Kannada. They spoke Mare Kannada, hidden Kannada. Experts in arguing that could match the poem, given with comparable theories, impossible of being grasped even by gods. Only they understand, not even gods understand their interpretations. The lotus born included, even Brahma can't understand the interpretation, let alone the poem. And multitudes of praise singers who, lifting up their hands, sang elaborately at right times. They know when to praise. At right times, the many titles of the praiseworthy one. O Lord, bringer of joys, slayer of multitudes of foes, O Lord of the whole earth, live as long as Brahma. And the smart ones, the hidden palm pleasure seekers, for whom bribe is the highest form of living. He calls them in Kannada, Lancha Parayanaru. For them, Bribe is the highest form of living. And wealth, the sole organ, for whom the rule once inscribed was the inscription of face domain. ಒಮ್ಮೆ ಬರೆದರೆ ವಿಧಿಯ ಸೀಮೆಯ ಲಿಖಿತ. And with that kind of severity, they would impose rules, but, or if the selfish greed or desire was satisfied, the king's rule was like the alphabet on water. So, vidiya seemeya baraha, if they wanted to punish somebody. If they were bribed, then it became Veera Lada Baraha, writing on water. And the woes of horsemen with glittering crowns, the pastmasters in managing horses, the reins woven, smiling away the arrogance of great Revanta, the storehouse of wisdom that dwarf the learning of sages like Nala, Nahusha, and Shilavahana. The Kauravas' court shone like that of the king of heaven, with elephant riders sitting near the lord of the Kurus, the masters lauded for pulling by the ear the heavenly elephant, drunken with pride and for straining with the Mahut's hook, colossal elephants carrying worlds. Within the king's ken were ambassadors, fast like the wind and loyal, able to invade and bend the foreign king to wrest tributes, and the brave ones able when enraged to hinder the path of time and to catch the jaws of the god of death. On the left of the king of Kurus were gathered dazzling beauties, appearing like lotuses shining like shoots of lightning, lotus-faced one, putting to shame the image of the moon, the tender-limbed ones weighed down with breasts and buttocks. The king looked prepossessed, his lion heart as every time he turned back the kings of Lala, Madhava, Turuka, Konkana, Gauda, Gurjara, Vangya, and Hamira bowed their heads. Trigartha sang his praises, and tender beauties raised their chauris. When Ravana's foes gifts were presented, the snake-flagged king looked conceited among his praise singers as if thundering, which place, which country is he from? What flaunting is this? What wealth? Look how strange his ways. And then this is where it continues. This announces that Krishna is arrived. So it says, call him, let him come, the master of cheats. That's the because describes it. Master of cheats. Saying thus, the king sent messengers fast like winds to Hari's camp. The messengers came through their bodies at the feet of Asuras foe, and so on. Then Krishna comes, and then the moment Krishna appears in this poem, Kumarivasa bursts into magnificent devotional poetry. Deva bandhanu, tannanivara, kava bandhanu, daitya kulavana, dava bandhanu, and so on. Remarkable poetry bursts into. There's no time to go into that. So this is just to give you a sample of this great translation of the Mahabharata into Kannada by Kumaravyasa. And incidentally, Kumaravyasa had never any truck with any court. Though he lived during Krishnadevara's period, he says it is said that he wrote the whole epic in the temple of Veeranarayana in a small village called Kodivada near Dharwad. He says he wrote in such a way, ಬರೆದ ಅಡಿಪದೊಂದಗಳಿಕೆ ಒಮ್ಮೆ ಬರೆದರೆ ಅಡಿಸದೊಂದಪ್ಪಳಿಕೆ. Once he wrote something, he would never cross out that line. Because he says, Kumara Veeranarayana Kavi, Dipikara Kumara Vyasa. It's Veeranarayana who is writing this. I am only copies. So, this very brief glimpse into the work of this great poet. Of course, this work is now being taken up by in Murti Library series, and maybe in a year or two, this condensed translation of this work should be available in English. Now, we go back to Shuddha Sampadi. I've already talked about Prabhupada a little bit, but I'm not going to read it because tomorrow we're going to read the two passages together. Now, please go through this. I said in Shunya Sampadne, there is a kind of diluting of a, an honest engagement with human sexuality. But the more they try to get away from it, the more they get into it. And this is a very complex passage. There are four versions of Shunya Sampadne from 14th to 17th century. The first version is by one Shivagana Prasadi Mahadevaya. It's a magnificent work. So in all these, second one is by Halege Arya, a century later. This text is taken from the second Shuddha Sampadne by Halege Arya. Third was by Guru Siddhavira Nodiya, a century later. The last one by Gumbara Siddhavira, a century later. So from 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th, four Shuddha Sampadnes were compiled. They use vachanas, texts, and organize them in the form of a play. The compiler writes the stage directions, the intervening narratives. So it's organized somewhat like Platonic dialogue. Of course, they knew nothing about Platonic dialogues, but this is the structure you have in this work. It begins with the invocation of Allama Prabhu as the embodiment of ultimate truth and describes his birth and how he conquers Maya. Allama is described both in Prabhulinga Lile and Shuddha Sampadne as Maya Kolahala. And then he went to, it's somewhat on the model of Shankara Vijaya, like Shankaracharya going to different places and engaging, theologians in arguments and defeating them. Allama goes to the famous saints of the period, not only the historical figures, but also some mythical figures. There is an encounter between Allama and Goraksha, for example. And the dialogues are very intense, very intense, profound philosophical debates. For example, there's a section of Allama's dialogue with a woman saint called Muktayaka, where there's a very subtle debate about the role of language in communication, for instance. And then in his dialogue with Akkamahadevi also, it's a remarkably profound passage. But this passage was introduced by Halege Arya. The meeting point of all the Sharanas, according to these narrators, whether Basava-centric, Allama-centric, is the city of Kalyana. And Kalyana, in Vachanas themselves, had become more than a city. It had become the symbol of a spiritual utopia, even in the Vachanas. Now, the Basava-centric and Allama-centric narrators build on this. So, Akkamaha Devi is on her way to Kalyana. And she comes to the assembly of mystics, which is another fragment of the imagination of these narrators. Anubhava Mantapa. There's no reference to Anubhava Mantapa in Vachanas. And if one goes to Kalyana of today, there is a hall built out of stone They say this was Anubhav Mandapa, but it appears to be a later day construction. Now imagine that there was this Anubhav Mandapa where all the saints met and debated the spiritual experiences. So Akamadevi wants to, is longing to go there. On her way, she meets one Kinnari Bommaya, uh, another Sharada. And this passage talks about what happens between them. And I hope you still have left with some impressions of the Vachanas of Kamadevi we read in the previous class. And I want you to go through this. Take 5 minutes and go through this, and then we'll come back. Yeah, yeah, this one. You want to sign it? You want to sign Rashid, this? The second piece, Manasija. There's some typing mistakes. Live on as Manasija, the main one. Yeah. Okay, shall we discuss this? Yeah. So, what do you feel about this passage? Her compositions are used to make up a story about her, which is not quite based on her composition, the spirit of her compositions. This is why I said the narrative that these people built were antagonistic to the just quintessence of Vachanas. Uh, Avakamadev's compositions, for example. And it's interesting that he arrogates to himself the right to test her. Why? Because sexually attracted by her. And his expression of sexuality itself is in very bad faith. He says, see, this is not a vachana, something that the anthologists have written. If she is absorbed in Shiva consciousness, I'll consider her my guru and mother and bow down to her. If she is in body consciousness, I'll take her as my woman. So he decides whether it's Shiva consciousness or body consciousness. He is completely steeped in body consciousness. He is trying to adjudge her. And then the Vachana comes. And again, look at Akama's, this Vachana is quoted, is addressed to brothers. There's a Vachana by Akama Devi. Kandu Khanadere Nivu Mandiri Annangadera. She was a very beautiful woman. She was walking naked, and many uh, males must have molested her. She says that this is the pot of piss, and the pitcher of shit. Why do you come after me like this? And she addresses these, the people who try to waylay her. But it's in plural, but now, which means that there is no organic relationship between the context created by the anthologists and the Vachanas themselves. And then he says that she calls him a brother. I remember when Nirbhaya rape happened, one academician from IIT said, it was simple, she should have called him brother, rapist brother, things would have been solved. So Akamadevi calls him brother. But is this web of words cannot stop me. Saying thus, when he caught hold of her, said Mahadevi. And look, she behaves in a very dignified way. She says, do what you like with my body. And he inserts his finger into her yoni, and this holy ash comes out. That's what she says. Then he's ashamed, and later Akamadevi pours out more holy ashes from her secret part. Kinari Mama is ashamed, and he blames himself, feels guilty of it, and Akamadevi comforts him, and both of them go to Kalyan. So what's happening in this passage is that Vachana texts are being recontextualized in an imagined dramatic space which hasn't got much to do with the signification of vachanas. But it so happened because of the powerful imagination of this period, like Shamarasa and Palkur Kesava was, of course, a great poet, and his translation is the Bhima Kavi in Kannada. What narratives, mythical narratives that these people have built up as a history for all scholars of the succeeding generation, including A.K. Ramanujan. And all the creative writers were written, including me, uh, plays and novels about this period. And there are a section of scholars who see this movement. First of all, I don't know whether we should call it a movement, a great revolution. For example, there's this scholar from Netherlands, Schouten, who has written this book, Revolution of Mystics. He calls it a revolution. There was another scholar from Toronto, Hiremalurishwaran, who says that this was Indian Reformation. It was a Protestant, Hindu Protestantism, he called it. And there are some Marxists who say that this was the revolution led by the working class artisans of those days. Everything was fine, but unfortunately they hadn't studied Capital Volume 1, so they failed. The Marxist interpretation. And recently we have this Shankaracharya's great inheritor, Balagangadhara, who says that there was no caste system in the Vachanas. Because the word caste is used only some 300 times in 20,000 pages, so how can this be important? The word used is kula, but unfortunately for him, jati and kula mean the same thing in most of our Indian languages. So he argues that this movement was the continuation of the philosophy of Shankaracharya, a position taken by an American scholar who's worked on Shunya Sampadne, Blake Michael, who says that this was the reassertion of Brahmanism. But all these pro and anti interpretations are not based on an honest encounter with the Vachanas, but on the construction which was made by the interpreters 200 years after the Vachanas. On the one hand, the hallmark of Vachanas is an honest encounter with human sexuality, and also the importance for the first time given to labor, kayaka, as the basis of spiritual enlightenment. In Shunya Sampadne, by Shivagana Prasadi Mahadevaya, no special mention is made of any one of these artisan saints. Interestingly, two artisan saints come up in Halagyarya's anthology. They are allowed to have their say, but ultimately Allama decides. And I'm just going to read out a summary of this two-page summary of this episode of Nuliya Chandaya in this text. Okay. This by one of the translator, Professor D. Shankar. There was a man called Chandaya, an honest man, if ever there was one. By profession, he was a rope maker. That was his traditional occupation. They say he had a wife called Suggawe. The couple made robes, sold them with the money earned, and they fed Jangamas. So this was, he was following the philosophy of Dasoha. I talked about the philosophy of Dasoha as opposed to Dana and Dharma, because this is an offering made to a guru, a Jangama, from one's own honest earnings and not from Parasati Paradana, which makes up the bounty of kings, which they give to Satpatras, that means only Brahmins. The couple made ropes, sold them with the money earned. They fed the Jangamas, the devotees of Shiva, before they themselves partook of the food. It was Chandaya's firm conviction that to revere and to feed the Jangamas was the most sacred of his sacred duties. It always came first with him. The worship of the teacher, the guru, and Shiva, the god, came later. One day, as it was his daily practice, he went to a field on the banks of a nearby river and began to cut the long, reed like elephant grass. After he had gathered a sufficient quantity, he made it into a bundle and was about to transfer it onto his head. Just then, the Ishtalinga. Now, in these narratives of the 14th century, Ishtalinga, the Shivalinga worn on the body, became the utmost expression of being a Virashaiva. In the Vachanas themselves, there is a lot of debate that goes on this. There are also reasons to believe, internal evidences, that not all of them wore this kind of Shivalingam, but the mark symbol becomes very important for these 14th century people. So here, the Ishtalinga falls down. Uh, uh, he always wore round his neck his personal god, the absolute in concrete form, somewhat like, he's giving some other simile, somewhat like chi of the Igbos of Achibi. Leave it out. Slipped and fell into the water. He saw it falling, but then thought it was wasteful to go after it and retrieve it because the whole exercise would come in the way of making ropes. For him, making ropes is important. Remember Madara Duraya, when Shiva appeared at the point of his chisel, he said, "Get lost. This is my worship." This would be sinful. So to be distracted even by the symbol, so called sacred symbol, to him was sinful. He left his Istalinga to its fate and moved on. But this Istalinga is very sad. This lifeless Istalinga takes on life. The Ishtalinga, abandoned by his own devotee, begged him to pick me up. Chandaya would not. He simply kept walking because he knew that it would mean neglecting his sacred duty. The Ishtalinga cried more loudly and said it would, if he stopped for just a moment, join him and follow him. Because the Ishtalinga is just born into the human world, can't even keep pace with him. He's walking very fast. He says, "Wait, I'll follow you." Chandaya answered without stopping, "No, you can go wherever you want. I will not stop." Totally beaten, the Ishtalinga, assuming the form of a man, unsprouted arms and legs and a head, chased his devotee and caught up with him. But Chandaya would not have him. "You went away on your own. You come back on your own." "Well, none of that is my concern." Ishtalinga caught hold of Chandaya's dhoti, wrapped itself in it, and would not leave him. Seeing no way out, Chandaya said, "All right, we shall go together and present our case before Madivada Machaya, Vashramant Machaya. Let him decide which one of us is right." The three together had a long discussion There's a very long discussion in the original text. At last, Madivara Machaya said, Chandaya, you take your Ishtalinga back. All Jangamas, they need to wear this. But you are free to impose any condition for taking your Ishtalinga back. I'll stand surety. Then Chandaya said he would take it back if it did, like himself, do honest labor in the service of Jangamas. The Ishtalinga agreed, carried bundle of ropes, and sold it to Basavanna for 1,000 gold coins and returned with the money, which made Chandaya very angry. He thundered, "You have cheated somebody! How could you get so much money?" Maybe Basavanna, being a miracle man, he knew the whole story. He gave him a lot of money, but Chandaya wouldn't have it. "Have you stolen it? Your labor is disproportionately rewarded. Go, return it." Ishtalinga had no option. It went back, collected the right price, and came back to Chandaya. This incident is followed by a long theological between Chandaya, and then Allama Prabhu intervenes and makes him uh, accept his linga back. So here, what is happening? The value of labor as liberation, Kaikave Kailasa. Duliya Chandaya expresses this value, defends it, but ultimately, because the anthologists decided that Jinuma, every episode, he accepts Allama's logic. So they're allowed to have the say, but ultimately, Allama decides everything. The same thing happens in Akamadevi's episode. After Akamadevi goes to Kalyana, and again, Allama, Basavanna, everybody starts testing her. They say, if you are transcended your body, why are you covering your secret parts with your long hair? Very cruel questions they ask. Ultimately, she subdues all of them, and they say she's like our mother. They accept her greatness. Shuddha Sampadna is a very interesting text where there's a lot of power in the subtext than in what the anthropologist is trying to demonstrate in the work. So, the Virakta tradition represented by Allama Prabhu and others in the Sharana period, the continuation of that we find in Allama-centric narratives in Prabhupada and Shuddha Sampadna. And the other tradition, which represented the militant Shiva devotion, represented by Samadha Vachana poets themselves, and then by Palkur Kesavanatha and Harihara, and later Raghavanka, etc., developed into uh, a very violent philosophy later. After this period of 12th century, another important thing that happened in the Kannada-speaking world is the conflict between Jainas and Virashivas. Of course, there was some conflict between Jainas and the Buddhas on the one hand, and Shaivas on the other in the Tamil period of Nayanmas. But here it became very intense, and there are several works which show that how militant the Shaiva. There's one work by Harihara, Ekanta Ramayana Ragade. Ekanta Ramaya is famous for massacring Jainas, pulling down their Basadis temples and converting them into Shiva temples. And there's another poem by Raghavanka. Incidentally, Raghavanka is a very interesting case. Raghavanka first wrote his Harishchandra Kavya. Of course, he depicted, according to the mythology, Harishchandra is a Vishnu Bhakta Raghavanka made him Shiva Bhakta, and he went and gave it to his offered this manuscript to his guru Harihara. Harihara was so angry that he gave him a hard slap because why have you written a work on somebody who is not a Shiva Bhakta? Harihara had written only about Shaivite saints of Tamil Nadu, Puratanas, and Shaivite saints of Kannada. He called them Nutana Puratanas, new Puratanas. And five of Raghavanka's teeth came out. And then, to satisfy his guru, he wrote five Shaiva Kavyas, and his teeth started coming back one by one. This is the legend. Anyway, one of the poems he wrote later was called Someshwara Charitra. And it's about Adaya, who is one of the Vachanakaras, but in his Adaya's Vachanas, there is no trace of militant Shaivism. But in his poem, he has been converted into militant Virashaiva. He is a devotee of Somanatha of Saurashtra, and he falls in love with a beautiful girl. Now, fall in love means they get into physical relationship, they have a very good time, but then he decides to marry her. Then he asks her, which faith do you follow? This question comes up for the first time in Kannada text. As I pointed out, in the early Jaina text, caste is not important. There is some discussion of caste in Pampa's Mahabharata, Pampa Bharata. In Yashoda Charita, caste has already been foregrounded. And then she says, I am a Jaina. They say, no, then I can't marry you. You are Parasamayi. You're a Bhavi. Whoever is not a Shiva Bhakta, militant Virashaiva was considered Bhavi, something which is the counterpart of heathen Christianity. And then, with great difficulty, she agrees to convert into Virashaivism and then they get married. And then Adaya pulls down the Jaina temple in her place and converts into a Shiva temple. And the conflict between Jaina, for some reason, Jainas thought that Bijjara was a Jaina. But according to historical evidence, one of the titles of Bijjara was Shiva Bhakta Gresara. The Kalachurya clan was devoted to Shiva. He was never a Jaina. For some reason, and Palkurika Somanara doesn't make him a Jaina, but later narratives have converted him into a Jaina. So Jainas wrote a work against Basavana called Bijjalaraya Purana, where Bijjara is the hero and Basavana is the villain. And Professor Shettar, who has worked on the Jaina voluntary deaths, which was happened in a big way between the 13th to 15th century around Shravana Belagada, says that this is the period which saw the maximum number of voluntary deaths among Jainas, and he ascribes this to the attacks of militant Shaivites. He says this is one of the reasons. Yes, I will conclude. So we've seen how these two streams developed into Allama-centric narratives and then Basava-centric narratives, which moved away from the artisan content, down-to-earth content of Vachanas. And what happened to this down-to-earth content? For that, we have to look outside the canon of what people have described as Virashaiva literature. I'll talk about it after the break.
wild place, Karnataka. It seems to be a very wild place. All the things you're telling us, it's a wild place. Something happens there that doesn't happen anywhere else. It seems, just on the basis of the materials that you've been talking about, it's some astonishing open horizon.
Yes, you can also consider the court that what
So what how do you explain it? What goes to the impulse in the first place of these watching yeah, but where what happened? I mean, what set it off? I don't understand. The story also is hard to understand. The Ishtalinga is running after this fellow. Running after him. Pleading.
The next story is Ishtalinga will go into the picture of audio for that.
Oh, how do you understand that? What's that? Also, I don't understand why Allama makes peace between them. The Ishtalinga and this fellow.
Because that's how it's said. Allama is.
But they had some idea.
Allama himself is the first student of mine.
Yeah.
When we discussed the Siddharama.
Yeah, Siddharama, I think.
Siddharama should wear the Ishtalinga. He was saying he doesn't have to. But later should be some point of making wear the shirt.
Understanding the logic
Allama
of
says
the
very
story.
clearly. ಕಲ್ಲ ಮೇಲೆ ಒಂದು ಬಿದಿರ ಮೇಲೆ ಒಂದು ಕಲ್ಲಿದ್ದಾರೆ there is a store on a bamboo ಆ ಕಲ್ಲು dig away